started off this morning, and I was almost done, and then the phone started ringing, and I answered it, and it led to other calls, and now it's this afternoon. Well, good morning, everybody. I started this morning, but then the phone started ringing. I'm a popular guy today. And anyway, now it's just after lunch, and I'm coming back to this, and hopefully this finishes us up. But our scripture reading today is John chapter 13, verses 21 to 31. That's what the lectionary says, but I'm going to have you read John 18 to 38. You can look at the link below. You can look it up in your home Bible, and it's a good time to pause the video if you haven't looked it up already. I guess I'll start just saying why I expanded it. I really like using the lectionary, and the lectionary is just a calendar of Bible verses. So it used to be everybody kind of had their own lectionary. I've got a really old book from our denomination that has a 2-year lectionary in the back that was sort of specific to us. But I think it was in the 60s they got together, all the denominations got together as an ecumenical project and put together a calendar of their own that we can all follow. It's not mandatory, it's just, well, for some denominations I think it is. I think in the Catholic and the Anglican Church you have to. But in our denomination it's optional. But I really like it because I like the idea that we're all reading the same things. And what I really like, and I know this is probably just a dream, but I would love it if my people were going home and talking to people from other churches that had read the same thing and come to different conclusions in the morning and then talked about that. I don't think any of us really have it right. But I think in the conversation, that's where the Holy Spirit can lead us to the conclusions that we need to be led to. I think it's in the conversation that we get closest to what God actually wants us to understand. And so, I don't know, I think the lectionary is really cool, and I think it's great that on Holy Wednesday, people all over the world are reading the same thing. But where the lectionary does have its limitations is that it's meant to be a compromise that all of us can live with. And one of the things that it seems to compromise on is that it doesn't like it when stories step on the toes of other stories from that season, or when the stories sort of get a little off topic, which I don't have a problem with. I don't mind if they overlap. And I'm a big picture guy, so I often will expand the lectionary passages. And so that's what I've done today, is just try and include, we're sort of covering the same fractions of the same story all week. And so we're already looking at a snippet, but I've kind of expanded that to just include more. And we're talking about something today that I've wanted to get at, and I have been getting at all week. And that is Judas and sort of his role and how we view him. I think we need to be really careful how we view Judas Iscariot. It's very easy to see him as the villain. He's definitely an antagonist rather than a protagonist in the story. He's someone that moves the plot forward through negative actions, in that he betrayed Jesus, but he still moves the plot forward. And that's something that Jesus in the story recognizes the importance of. I heard it once said that the problem with Judas is not necessarily that he betrayed Jesus, but that he never asked forgiveness. We know that Judas killed himself afterwards. And the way I've always viewed that is, God's grace is always there no matter what we've done. And what a great story that would have been if God's grace were extended to someone like Judas Iscariot. And it would have been. I think the challenge comes when we're able to accept it. And I think after the resurrection, the scale of what Judas did would have been so obvious to him that I think he probably just couldn't accept the grace that was there to be offered. Anyway, that's not what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about is just, let's put Judas in perspective. The disciples had been following Jesus for 3 years at this point. These were 12 people. Jesus' ministry was not to us. Jesus' ministry was to the disciples, who then came to the rest of us. Their ministry was us. And so Jesus dedicated his life to Judas and the 11 others for 3 years, dedicated his teaching. That was an intense 3 years. And they left, not all of them had good lives, but they left what they knew to follow Jesus. So some of them, fishermen or whatever, they left legitimate jobs and businesses and families so that they could follow Jesus along. And that's not that's significant. That is extremely significant. So then you come into Holy Week, and probably the weeks before Holy Week. I always like to remind people, John's not really a history book. John's a theology book. He retells the story in an effort to interpret, not communicate history. So things didn't happen exactly the way John tells them. John's trying to convey truths and ideas. So probably before Holy Week, Jesus started talking, well, we know from the other Gospels before Holy Week, Jesus started talking about his death and resurrection and things like that. And I think for some Christians, what I'm about to say is going to be tough, but I want you to really think hard about it. The resurrection is a hard sell, and it would have been a harder sell then than it is today. We still, a good chunk of the world does not believe in the resurrection because people don't come back from the dead. It just never happens. And even Christians struggle with the resurrection. But we've got 2,000 years of telling each other that story, and we've got 2,000 years of history with this story. So, we've got the support. They didn't have that. They were before the resurrection. And yes, they were more mystical people. Lazarus had been raised from the dead. But this was hard. This was really, really hard for them. And so if you dropped everything to follow Jesus for 3 years, and all of a sudden he starts talking about being betrayed and being arrested and killed and rising from the dead, you're probably going to lose faith in whatever's going on. And through the week, we watch everybody lose faith. We start with the triumphal entry, which is Jesus and the disciples entering Jerusalem on a high. And, I figure there's probably 1,000 or 2 people there, which would have seemed like just everybody in Jerusalem turning out. But Jerusalem was a city of, I think, 120,000. And it probably would have been 300 and 400,000 during Passover because everybody came to Jerusalem. This was a drop in the bucket. And so they would have been on this high. They were achieving everything they were achieving as they entered Jerusalem. And then Jesus is reading the writing on the wall. He knew that everything was going to come together to conspire to kill him. He could see that it was happening. He could see how threatening he was, despite his peacefulness. And he starts talking about it. And he starts saying, don't worry, I'll come back from the dead. It'll be fine. And if you were one of his disciples, I want you to just appreciate how crazy that would have sounded. One of my favorite stories from, I think this was a little later, but from that era, was this Roman general. This is the time of no health care and lead plumbing. So there's this Roman general who famously had lead poisoning, and he was tremendously successful, and he marched his way across Europe. He was going to invade the British Isles, and he would have. But he got to the English Channel, and he declared war on the sea, sent his troops in to collect a bunch of shells, and then went back to Rome. This kind of thing happened in those days. I mean, it still kind of happens today, but it definitely happened in those days. And so if you're one of the disciples, are you maybe thinking, oh, Jesus has lead poisoning, or maybe he was wrong all along, or maybe he's. Are you having full faith in Jesus? And we know that by the time Jesus was arrested and crucified, most of them lost faith. I expanded the story, and the reason is to keep Peter in there. Peter was almost dumbly enthusiastic. There's the joke about Peter's name, Petros, in Greek, which means rock. He was the rock the church was built on, but he was also hard-headed. And he's almost comic relief. It's not always apparent in translation, but he's almost comic relief through the Gospels, because he was just so, almost like a dog, just so enthusiastic that he missed the point a lot. So you've got Judas earlier in the week. He's the first one to lose faith, probably before the week. He was probably on his way out. And then Peter, the last one. Everybody lost faith this week. And I've been talking about expectations this week, and the reason was that Jesus did not meet the expectations they had. In the end, it turned out that he far exceeded their expectations, but they did not know that yet. And Judas was one of those people. Judas was one of the first ones to start asking questions, and ultimately betrayed Jesus. But I want to also point out that Judas is integral to the story. Jesus knew what was going to happen. Jesus knew what had to happen. And I talked a little bit yesterday about the power just of Jesus' death, let alone his resurrection. And we'll talk more about that on Good Friday. But, Jesus knew what was going to happen, and someone had to betray Jesus. Remember, this was before wanted posters. They didn't have photography. The authorities probably didn't know what Jesus looked like. And even if they'd seen him, memory is a funny thing, and they might have mistaken him for anyone else in the crowd. So they needed someone to point out who he was. Jesus probably could not be arrested without Judas. He was integral to the story. And I guess what I want to leave you on today is just wondering about negative actions that, God didn't cause Judas to do what Judas did. The circumstances caused Judas to do what he did. But God made, as far as Christians are concerned, the biggest moment in history possible through Judas Iscariot. And again, I think the sad thing about Judas was not what he did, because that was going to happen. He was a cog in the machine. It was that he couldn't ask for forgiveness afterwards. That's the tragic thing about Judas. And so I just want to ask you and I think this is a particularly poignant question during COVID-19, what negative thing is God working through today? I'm not saying God causes the negative things, but God can use all things. And so I think it's really important when bad things happen to look around us. It's like Mr. Rogers said, when there's a crisis, don't look at the crisis, look for the helpers. And I think that's the message here today is when there's a crisis, what good can God do through that crisis? And we're all going through personal crises all the time anyway. But we're going through a crisis as a whole population right now. And so what's God doing in your life and in the world? Amen.